Hey everyone, it is Jaime Jo Wright here with another episode of Madlet Musings. And today I have my good friend Cara Putman with me. Hey Cara,
Hello. Thanks so much for having me, Jamie. It's always great to be with you.
it's fun to be here and I feel like we're reciprocating. Like I've been on your podcast, Book Talk with Cara Putman. That's a plug. Everybody go check it out. And now I finally get to have you on mine, so I'm excited. This is good.
No, it's always fun to have you on, and I love talking about your books, and it's so much fun just getting to dig deep into what makes our books fun and unique
Yeah.
and different. And
Yeah.
yours are so ghostly, and mine are not.
No, yours aren't. But that's one of the reasons I love to read your suspense because yours are there's an element of law involved because you're a lawyer, right? And this is The Vanished. Look at that. I love it. I love it. I love that cover too. It looks so great. For those of you who are listening and you're on a podcast and not watching on YouTube, you can hop over to the YouTube channel Madlet Musings and see the book cover because it's cool.
It's so cool. The publisher did a great job because the book has it's very much the legal
Hmm.
suspense because that's kind of where I've been leaning the last couple of years.
Right.
But I was able to pull in my love for art as well.
Hmm.
And so it was really fun when I got the first draft of the cover because you never know which direction a publisher is going to go. I don't know that readers understand how little control that as authors we
Right.
have on details like that. We fill out,
Hmm.
detailed questionnaires,
Right.
but then it's kind of like sending it into a void and you're like, what are you going to do to my baby? What's it going to
Hmm.
look like? What's it going to,
Hmm.
how are you going to package it? And the backdrop on the cover is actually like paint textured. It looks like a canvas.
Yes.
And then they overlaid like a heroine and a what looks like a court or a museum, depending on how you want to look at it, on kind of the top of this
Hmm.
artsy canvas paint textured kind of backdrop. And I just was like, I almost squealed when I saw it because it's just
Yeah.
perfect.
Yeah. There's like you get your book covers and there's covers that I've received where I'm like, oh, I love it. It's beautiful. I love
Yeah.
it. And then there's that cover that comes and you open and you're like, oh, your breath catches, your heart stops beating for a second. You're like, this is a work of art in and of itself.
Yeah. And then there are those where you're like, and this is not it at all.
Right?
So
I
when you
had
get
one
that
of
one where your
those.
heart stops and you're
Yes.
like, this is it.
Yes.
It's such a good feeling. And
Yes.
I've been fortunate because I've had many more where it's that catch where you're like, oh my gosh, they got it. Than
Yeah.
the one where you're like,
Ugh.
oh no, how do I help fix this? And so,
Right.
it's so
Yes.
special when you're like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
this captures, it gives people a feel for what the story is all about. And so
Hmm.
it's such
Hmm.
a special feeling.
Yeah. No, I love that. I had one book cover come through and it wasn't like an ooh. It was just it was absolutely gorgeous, but I was like, this is too pretty. Like it's too
Yeah.
romantic for my books.
Yeah,
So
like
you've got
how
those
do we
two
make
that
it eerie?
right, you have to look at book covers and be like, you want it to be great, but you also want it to reflect the mood.
Yeah.
And your book, like, so the book cover that you have with The Vanished, which is the book we're talking about, it's The Vanished. It's published by Kriegel Publications. Comes out April 16th. But the cool thing is, what I loved about it is the silhouette of the heroine is almost black. So it gives you that
Yeah.
vanished feeling like she was there, but she's not there anymore.
Yeah.
And I
And
love
so
that.
and it's fun because you know it's it's kind of going into this idea of who owns art and what
Hmm.
happens when it disappears and then it's recovered and it suddenly appears and who owns it and these kind of deep ideas. And what was so fun is I've been in love with the World War II and I've been in love
Right.
with art for a long
Hmm.
time, but I've been writing contemporary. So one of my award-winning books back in 2015 was
Hmm.
Shadowed by Grace, which it
Yes.
focuses on the monuments men during World War II. And then, you pull forward to last year in September, I had a novella in a collection with Kriegel where they asked me to write another book set during World War II. And I got to again look at the
Right.
monuments men, but at a different time period
Hmm.
with what were they doing at the end of the war. And so the monuments men were really focused on what do we do during this, a full invasion of, everybody's fighting each other, but it's a totally different kind of war. everything's being bombed and there's this
Hmm.
decimation happening on a scale that hadn't been seen before. And so there's this focus on how do we save Western civilization, essentially?
Yeah.
How do we
Yeah.
save these locations, this art? And so it was really interesting to dive into with We Three Kings and Beauty Bright specifically. How did they go about actually returning the art after it
Right.
had been reclaimed,
Yeah.
and kind of those races that we saw with the movie with George Clooney, but then
Hmm.
also in the book I'd written, the idea of racing to save the art, but then how do you actually return it? So then with the Vanish, I'm actually looking at museums are still wrestling with the kind of the leftovers of this whole concept of art disappeared.
Hmm.
And it's still a concept that's very much being dealt with today. In
Yeah.
fact, I was talking with some of our uh, art historian, museum conservation folks here at Purdue just a couple weeks ago, and they were talking about the Met in New York is dealing with that just in the
Wow.
last few weeks with someone who had made a donation. And there's some serious provenance issues with some of the art. And this particular person is just like, I'm not dealing with it. It's good. You're just going to have to trust me. And so these
Oh,
are still very real issues,
yeah.
not all related to the war. And so those are some of the things I'm diving into. And
Hmm.
you should have seen the stack of research books. I mean,
Oh, I can only imagine. I can only
I
imagine.
was having way too much fun digging into just the stories, but then the law, and then having to throw out all these things that I wanted to pull into the book
Right.
because y'all might not geek out on it as much as I was.
Well, and there's only so much you can put into a book before it becomes a documentary instead of a fiction
Exactly.
novel.
Yeah. You don't want a full 3 credit class on
Yes.
what do we
Yes.
do when there's a question about who owns the art. But it was so fun to really kind of dive into it and
Hmm.
explore it. And if you've seen like the movie The Woman in Gold,
Hmm.
and there's all these different ways that people have approached it at different points in time.
Hmm.
And so, but what do we do? And it's still very current and very real and something
Yeah.
that we're confronting. And then, of course, you've got to murder some people and add in
Oh, of
some
course.
romance and weave it all
Right.
together. And that's a little bit of what's going on in The Vanish.
You can't have art and the rescue of old classic art without some murder. I mean, it's
Of
just
course not.
inevitable.
Yeah, especially if I'm writing it.
Right, exactly. I actually thought of you the other day though, and I was thinking of The Vanish, and this is going to be the weirdest connection, so bear with me. But I was watching Denzel Washington's movie, The Equalizer 2. So it's the second Equalizer, which
Okay.
is extremely violent movie. It's just one of those movies where the guy goes and tries to equalize all the vengeance in the world.
Okay.
But what's funny is he finds these people that need help. And he built this relationship because he's like a Lyft driver or something. He builds this relationship with this 90-some-year-old man who is consistently going to court on a regular basis to fight for ownership of a painting that has been circulating since the war. And so he's telling, and this is a completely side story. Like this isn't even the main thrust of the movie. And I'm going,
Oh,
that's the
wow.
that's the one I want to watch. Like, can we make that into a movie? Because
Yeah.
he's telling Denzel Washington's character about this painting and how he just wants to get it back because it has a connection to his sister who he lost in one of the camps during the war. And when he was 9, his sister was his older sister and she was protective, blah, blah, blah. Movie goes on. And you can see during this movie, while Denzel is doing all this other stuff to equalize the world, he's also sending emails about this man and his painting to a friend in high places. Then at the end of the movie, that shows this man, it's like the wrap up scene. He's sitting in his assisted living environment and the manager comes in and is giving him his typical, you know, I know that you go after the painting on a regular basis, and you have to understand there are things that just can't be overcome in ownership with classic art. And so he kind of takes this man on this journey, which you can tell he's done before. And he goes, but we did have something turn up just out of the blue. And then this old lady comes in the room, and it's his sister who he hasn't seen. So Denzel Washington set out to try and find the painting. and
That
get
is so
ownership. And he found his sister instead. And that's how the movie ends. Like this old man is like holding on to his sister and they're crying. And I'm like, I want this into a movie. And I'm like, I've got to tell Kara about this.
oh my gosh, that sounds amazing.
I
So
know.
maybe I'll watch those scenes of the
Yes, just
movie
watch those
instead of the rest of it.
scenes. Yes,
That sounds so beautiful and so redemptive in the
it
middle
was.
of the rest of it. That's
Right.
so cool.
Right. It was. And I think the writers of the screenplay did that for that purpose,
Oh,
to
of
bring
course,
that
because it gives you that
redemption.
opportunity. I mean, think about
Hmm.
it as a storyteller, it gives you that opportunity to breathe and
Right.
to see this character who could be seen as potentially the bad guy,
Hmm.
the redemptive
Hmm.
side of him.
Right. Right. Right.
Yeah.
And it was so cool because you also saw the threads of, they did a good job very subtly showing the threads of lost art,
Mhm.
but how the lost art had such sentimental and deep connection to the people who were the original owners
Yes.
for whatever purpose. So I thought that was really cool too. And it felt like it tied a little bit into where you've gone with some of your books.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons that I keep kind of coming back to it is because
Hmm.
each piece of art actually tells the story of the family.
Yeah.
And so there's a reason it's gone missing. There's a story behind its disappearance.
Hmm.
And when it's tied to World War II, it's usually because there's a plaque in front of the home. And so if
Hmm.
you're in Europe, and I've seen these plaques in Germany, in Holland, in Italy, there is a plaque in front of
Hmm.
many apartment buildings and homes where if you, I've learned you look down, you look up. When you're in Europe, you always look
Hmm.
down. But when
Yeah.
you're looking down, I'm looking for the little, and they're about this size. They're about, for those of you listening, like 3 by 3 inch
Hmm.
little brass or some kind of bronze kind of
Hmm.
tile that's put into the sidewalk, and on it will be inscribed the name of the Jewish person who was taken from that location, their date of birth, their date of death, and
Hmm.
where they, which camp they were taken to,
Yeah.
and when they were, why they were killed, and if were they killed at the camp, did they die
Right.
in transit, something like that. And so it can be very sobering if you know to
Hmm.
watch for those,
Right.
because you can see, um, kind of the, in like these little snapshots of these little 3 by 3 squares, walking by in Hanover, Germany, and you'd see like
Hmm.
in front of one building, you'd see like a 9 by 9 grid,
Oh,
or I guess a three
yeah.
by three grid.
Yeah.
Here
Hmm.
was a location where there was many Jewish people who had been taken.
Right.
And then you'll go blocks, but then you'd be in Rome and you'd see another
Hmm.
grid, or in
Hmm.
Florence, and saw some of those in, Holland as well. And so that's the kind of thing that each of those paintings or those pieces of art
Right.
can represent as well. But it's not just restricted to the war,
Right.
because provenance applies. I mean, you go to the Vatican Museum, and there's a huge dispute. The same thing at the British Museum of, okay, well, these pieces of art were taken in conquest.
Hmm.
And so there's kind of this dispute over, well, should they be returned to the civilizations they were taken from?
Right.
And there's a real question about that. And so you can look at it and go, should it be returned to Egypt? Should it be returned to
Right.
the whoever it would be the owner in like the Mayan civilization now?
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and I'm like, well, there's also a reality that they may not still exist if they hadn't been relocated. But then what do we do with them now? And so
Right.
there's these huge ethical, legal, cultural questions surrounding art and the ownership. And then there's the stories. And I think that's why I find it so
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. Oh, that's thrilling. So, okay, so take us into your story a little bit then, because
Yeah.
we've danced around all the topics within the story as far as the art goes, but take us a little bit into what your actual story is about, who your heroine is, and go from there.
Yeah, so the heroine is a young woman in her late 20s, turning 30, who is an attorney who has to return home because she
Hmm.
made a mistake. And so she's returning home kind of with her tail between her legs, going, this is not where I wanted to be, and returning to a fictional small town, kind of bedroom community outside of
Hmm.
DC. And she left for a reason that kind of starts spooling out over the course of the story. Um, and so she's been in a big high powered firm, and now she's in rural Virginia going,
Mhm.
what am I doing here?
Yeah.
And has to kind of create a space for herself. And the hero is a curator of a museum for a college. And so he's at a curator for a museum in a college, and he has guardianship of his nephew.
Mhm.
And that kind of comes into play throughout the story as well. But they kind of collide because, as the curator for the museum, at the opening of a show, the first show that he's like in charge of, an old woman standing in front of a painting and going, that belongs to my family. And so he needs an attorney
Mhm.
and she needs a client, and they end up finding each other and having to kind of work through this. And then there's all these other things going on,
Yeah.
secrets and all kinds of things. So it's
Secrets and
a,
lies, and that's about all we can say without creating spoilers.
yes, exactly. But there's secrets from her past,
Hmm.
and there's a lot of questions regarding the nephew, and there's just all these things going on. And so, but she's also stepping back into a community that she grew up in,
Okay.
and there's the tension with that. And I think a lot of us know that, anytime you go back home, no matter how good your childhood was, there are things you don't want to go back to.
Right.
And
Right.
so, and in her situation, it's not all good, but it's
Hmm.
not all bad.
Hmm.
Um, and she's got this great grandmother. The grandmother was so much fun to write, just a really cool character.
Don't
And
you love those characters that are such a
yeah,
hoot and you're just like, I just kind of want to stay with this person forever.
yeah, yeah. And it was really fun because I was writing her right after losing my grandmother. And
Oh,
so it was just really sweet because, in a lot of
yeah.
ways, I mean, my grandma was just amazing. And so I was imagining my grandma as I
Hmm.
was writing that grandma. And so it was just a fun kind of way to pay tribute to her.
Yeah.
And just, yeah, so it was neat. And then it's a part of Virginia that I know
Hmm.
well from having lived there for 8 years, but it's not in DC. It's very specifically kind of a bedroom community
Okay.
out in right on the edge of the Shenandoahs.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful area too. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so that's really cool. So anyone who wants to read about art, suspense, law, all of that will really enjoy this. I love Cara Putman's books. I don't think
Oh,
I've
thank
made
you.
that a secret. But okay, so one of the thoughts that went through my mind though as we were talking here is, and this is a deep one, so get ready. Why do you think why do you think art is important to culture? Especially from the perspective of a believer who might make the argument that it's something we can't take with us eternally. So you could say it's storing up our treasures on earth instead of heaven. So why would art be so important to culture and us as a community of Christ?
That's such a really interesting question.
I gave you
Um,
no warning on that either.
yeah,
Kara's like, thanks, Jamie.
no, but it's a really good one because it really wasn't until I took an art appreciation class in
Mhm.
college that I started going, oh, art's kind of cool. My mom would drag us to museums because we were
Okay.
homeschooled, and she was
Mhm.
like, you must go to museums. I'm like, museums, yuck.
Right.
Um, and then I started learning about art, and it's been really fun because of taking students on study abroad. My kids have grown up. My daughter, my oldest, is actually in an art appreciation class right now.
Oh, cool.
And she's having the fun experience of going, oh, I've actually seen that in the
Nice.
museum. I've seen
Yes.
that because we've gone to places like the Uffizi
Hmm.
in Florence and the Vatican museums and the British Museum. And, the thrill of in the last 6 months was going to the Van Gogh Museum in
Mm,
Amsterdam when I was
neat.
there for a conference. And,
Yeah.
there's something about seeing it versus just like seeing it on a
Right.
screen or whatever.
Yeah.
But what I would say is there is something about the creative process that, as writers,
Hmm.
I'm sure you experience this. Eric Little would say, I sense God's pleasure when I run, and I
Mm,
sense God's pleasure when I write.
hmm.
I think a lot of us, when we're creating, we're tapping into the creative nature of God, and we're
Mm,
reflecting that piece of his character. And so for all of us, it's different. It shows up in different ways. Some of us, it's when we're baking. Some of us, it's when we're designing our house and
Mhm.
creating a welcoming environment. For others of us, it's writing, or it's
Mhm.
painting, or it's ceramics, or whatever. And it could be how you plant your flowers in front of your house, but all of it reflects the creative nature of God. And so there's something about art that, like, literally going to the Van Gogh Museum, and I've always loved Van Gogh, but you could see, and the quotes that they had paired with his art, there's, he was the son of a pastor,
Mhm.
and his journey, I mean, there was a lot of brokenness in him, but there was also in his art, you can see him seeking God, and
Mhm.
it's part of how he communicated with God. And when I'm standing in front of a, landscapes aren't necessarily my favorite, but
Mhm.
when I'm standing in front of them, I can see God because I'm seeing a
Mhm.
representation
Mhm.
of his creation. And when I'm standing in front of a 12th century Italian um, altarpiece, I can laugh at how the feet aren't anchored to the ground. I can laugh at how they've painted in the patron who paid for the art into the manger scene.
Right.
They weren't there.
Right.
But I can also be like, but it's art at that time was how people learned the Bible
Mm,
because they couldn't read.
that's
And
so
so
true.
art was how people learned the stories of the Bible. There wasn't a printing press. People didn't know how to read. And so art has played a pivotal role across history. And so
Mhm.
there's value in that. And it's a part of our context, it's a part of knowing where we've come from. And I don't have to love it all,
Mhm.
but I can still see beauty in it. I can still see humanity in it. Um, and I can still find value in it. And
Yeah.
so I think there's still something worth saving
Mhm.
and treasuring, even if it's not going to heaven with me. There's going to be art in heaven that makes
Right.
everything here a faint shadow.
Right.
But I also believe that because God's created that need for beauty in us,
Mhm.
I think he smiles when we take the time to create art.
Mhm. I love
That
that.
he designed us with that right brain need to create. And he smiles when we're activating that.
Mhm. So in a sense, art becomes a picture into the heart of God in a
I think
big,
it
deep
does.
way. Yeah. I love that. What a great answer. You solved all my problems.
I don't know about that. That's my like initial reaction.
No, I think it's a great one though, because I'll have conversations with individuals who are like, we shouldn't be spending so much time trying to preserve all these things that are just, that evangelical term is they're just gonna burn anyway.
Yeah,
And yeah, there's truth to that. So then you're kind of like, well, I don't like that argument, but I don't know how to argue against it, but I feel like I should be able to, right?
yeah.
Because there
Well,
is
and I
value in that,
and I think there's something to, you never know what God's going to use to reach someone's heart.
right?
And so sometimes it's the beauty of a mountain.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's, another person,
Mm-hmm.
but God can use anything to reach someone. And
Yeah.
so, it's, there's something to the beauty of sitting in a museum and being confronted.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was Salvador Dali. There's a crucifix that he painted that's just, I'll never forget standing in front of it. I forget who the painter was. I'm pretty sure it was Salvador
Sure.
Dali, but I
Okay.
remember standing in front of it going, I would have never put that painter with this image of Christ.
Right.
And yet there are people who will go into a museum and
Mm-hmm.
look at great art who would never walk into a church.
Right.
And maybe that's where God's going to prick their heart.
Yeah.
And
Mm.
so I think that has value.
Yeah. Well, on that note, hold up your book again so we can see it if we're on YouTube. You're all going to want to
The
get The
Vanished.
Vanished because if this conversation hasn't already convinced you, the book cover should. Um, but it's The
It's
Vanished by
beautiful.
Cara Putman. And this is the first in another two more coming in
Yeah.
this trilogy.
Yeah. I'm
Okay.
working on edits for the next one right now.
Yay.
So, yep.
Awesome. Good. All right. So people can order this anywhere books are
Yeah, it's
sold.
available everywhere. So you can support your favorite indie bookstore. You can go to Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Books a Million,
Mhm.
wherever you like to get your books.
Right. And an easy place, if you can't remember where to go, is just go to caraputman.com because you've got links all right
Absolutely.
there. Yes.
Yep.
Cara, thank you so much for being here. This was just a blast, and we will have you back with book two when
Thank
that's
you so
ready.
much. And thanks for having me. It's always a joy to get to spend time with you, Jamie.